So, hang on, just getting my screen set up. So the first section that I wanted to talk to you about is global conservation. I have spent my career so far doing bird conservation all across the globe. Here's a map of some of the places that I've worked in my career so far. And our tour is going to start in the Northeast. I'm actually from Vermont originally. So hang on, my slides are not moving forward. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start in the Northeast. And so I'm a Vermonter. I went to the University of Vermont for my undergraduate training in wildlife biology and environmental science. And then my first real job was actually working in New York at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I was a bird conservation intern with Audubon New York, the Cornell Lab, and National Audubon. And it was a really great way to get my feet wet in terms of conservation and conservation planning. And I worked on a bunch of different species-specific projects. So I worked on the golden-winged warbler project, where they were working to document all of the golden-winged warblers across the state, and as well as some of the associated species, which I'll talk about later in my talk. I also worked on forest bird projects. So the wood thrush is one of those species that's declining in the state. It's partly from, historical changes with acid rain and loss of calcium in the forests. And then I also worked on larger scale conservation planning. So I was helped out with the initial assessments in the state of New York for identifying important bird areas. And then I also worked at the national and international level, helping to prioritize and assess the conservation status of species nationally and across Canada, the US, and Mexico. And that's through a project called Partners in Flight. So I really had quite a broad introduction to conservation planning, also field work. And then I was also helped out with the initial beta version of eBird. I helped to create a lot of the hotspots that you see when you go into eBird. And then of course, that's where I learned to be a birder. It was probably the best place in the world to learn how to be a birder. I was out birding all the time with like Kevin McGowan and Ken Rosenberg and others at the lab who you may have heard of. And they really helped me get going and learn all of the species and the songs. And I was constantly nagging them, what's that, what's that, what's that? That's really where I got hooked on birding. So then I took my skills from there and I went all the way across the globe. And I went down to New Zealand. There I was working on an endemic. Of course, there's a lot of endemic species to New Zealand. And I worked with this species, which is called the North Island Kakako, or the blue-wattled crow. And so you can see the blue wattles on the cheeks. That's pretty diagnostic for them. And then the other really special thing about this bird is that it has almost completely given up its ability to fly. So when it flies, all it can do is glide. It can't gain height. It'll just kind of flap and glide. So what it does instead is it'll run up the tree branches, pretty much like a squirrel. You can think of a gray squirrel. And they'll run up the tree branches and then go to the top of the tree, and then they'll glide down to get across an opening or to another tree. So they're really cool individuals, and there's not very many left. There's only a few on the North Island. The South Island population or species is already extinct. And because they're up in the canopy all the time, it's actually quite hard to catch them. But we did succeed. We would cut down a swath through the forest and then put up these huge canopy nets. We'd use, we'd throw strings and stuff way up over the top of branches up in the top of the trees and hang the nets from those with this elaborate pulley system. And then we would hoist that up there and then occasionally catch one of these birds. And then we were color banding them and looking at their pair bonds and which pairs had, where their territories were and how they interacted with neighboring pairs. And one of the things that I really learned while I was in New Zealand that I hadn't been as aware of through my training in the US, in the Northeast particularly, was the impact of invasive species. So on New Zealand, as probably many of you know, the only native mammal to the islands are bats. And so all of the other mammals that you see there have been introduced. And because a lot of the species there are ground nesting species, a lot of them have lost the ability to fly. Anytime that any of these species are introduced, their populations of the native birds just plummet. So they have quite a big problem with rats, with weasels, and with the Australian possums. And before I went to New Zealand, I was really, idealistic, and I thought, oh, all of the species, every individual animal has a right to survive. It's not their fault that they were put there and now their population is out of control. But then when you're working on these really small islands and you're facing losing species, like entire species and groups of species going extinct, it really forced me to reconsider my opinion. And I'm still not entirely comfortable with the amount of baiting and trapping that they do. But I can really understand and see why that is important there. We would lose many, many species if there weren't these efforts. So this was kind of this really different perspective to conservation, a very hands-on management, and they were putting out, you can see this picture on the left, you can see that they're putting traps way out in the wilderness. They hire people that carry huge backpacks and they just go backpacking into the wilderness and put out traps all over the entire island. It's a very intensive, massive effort just to keep these species alive. So from there, I went back to Vermont, my home state, and I worked on a citizen science program called Mountain Birdwatch. So that's a program that's organized by the Vermont Center for Ecostudies, and it focuses on mountain species across the Northeast, so New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. The star focal species is Bicknell's thrush, of course, which they're only singing at, from 3:30 to 4:30 in the morning. We ask volunteers to hike up the mountains in the dark to try to survey these species. So this was a really fun project where I got my first taste for working with the public and really learning how motivating and engaging it is to work with people like yourselves. And then, of course, Bicknell's thrush is a migratory species. So I also followed it down to their wintering grounds on Hispaniola. So Hispaniola is the island with Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And when I was working in Hispaniola, I really learned about this focus of basing conservation on communities, engaging the whole community and having them be really involved in the conservation efforts. So here's a picture of the actual border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And you can see that Haiti is completely denuded of forest, and the Dominican Republic still has a fair bit of native forest. And that's all because of the way that national parks are set up, the way that the governments are run, how conservation and the environment are prioritized. And then in Haiti, you have basically these communities that are just trying to survive, and they're doing whatever they can to survive. Whereas in the Dominican Republic, there's a little bit more support for people there, and they have a little bit more respect for nature. And so whenever you want to do any sort of conservation project on the island, you really need to involve the local communities and allow them to see the importance of what you're doing. So another project that I did in Hispaniola was working to identify additional breeding locations for the black-capped petrel. So the black-capped petrel is this species that only breeds on a few islands in the Caribbean. And it nests in burrows, and it's mostly active at night. And so what we did was we hiked to this really remote area, to this mountain that you see on the bottom here called Peak Makaya, which is down in the very far southwestern corner of Haiti. And there's no trails, and we had to go into the nearest village and hire a bunch of local people to take us up there and schlep all of our water and gear and everything. And then we camped out up top, and then sat out in the rain on the top of the mountain listening for these birds doing their courtship. They do this really weird like growling kind of sound when they're swirling around and trying to find mates. So it was really important because there's only a few documented locations. That's the second location known for Haiti for these species to be breeding. So there's still a lot of opportunities even in this area of Haiti where there's basically no nature left. It's just really, it was really amazing there how, if you talked to people about water and if they wanted to have consistent water supply, then they shouldn't, cut down all of their trees. And that's really powerful. And the people were really, welcoming and kind-hearted and just, really ready to take on new ideas as well, as long as it was compatible to their livelihood. So from there, I went to Wyoming. It's about as opposite as you can get, going from the tropics to the high desert out west. And the reason I went there was to study for my master's degree. My graduate project was studying Cassia Crossbill. So this is the newest red crossbill species that was split off a few years ago from the red crossbills. It used to be type 9. It's now its own species. And it breeds only in two small mountain ranges in southern Idaho. And they're really dependent on these pine cones from lodgepole pine that basically the cones are really hard and durable, and then only after years of exposure to the elements or to fire do the cones open up and the seeds become available for the crossbills. And what we found was that their population has been plummeting. It's predicted to go extinct by 2050 at the latest. And what we believe is happening with that species is that warmer temperatures, so because of climate change, there's warmer temperatures, and those cones are opening up a lot sooner. And so there's a lot fewer cones available for them to eat. So their food supply is dwindling, and it just can't support as many of them anymore. But this was a really fun project. You know, it exposed me to completely different habitat and part of the country, but then also really honed some of my scientific research skills. And then throughout all of that traveling there, I did a lot of other field jobs, kind of filling in the gaps and doing a lot of volunteer work as well. So I studied common loons, and I participated in Butterfly Atlas in Vermont. I volunteered in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. That's where the Ani is from. In Arkansas, I was part of the ivory-billed woodpecker search crew, although I did not see the bird. And then I also worked on a tern island off the coast of Maine, where I had common and roseate terns breeding. So all of those experiences allowed me this really more in-depth view of the behavior of species, of birds in particular, and learning more about their habitat requirements. And then I moved to Switzerland. And I moved to Switzerland because when I was in Wyoming, I met my husband, who is Swiss. So we moved there for a few years, and one of the things I learned there is that their approach to conservation is very different, and they really focus on bioindicators. So these are species that indicate the health of the local system. So if you this picture here of a fertile meadow on the left, if you have a windchat, this bird that's pictured here, or this cricket, then you know that meadow is really healthy and is supporting a whole suite of other species. And so their approach is to kind of look for these key species, kind of umbrella species, if you will, and do kind of a quick assessment that way. They also use often not just the birds, but also dragonflies. So I also took a dragonfly course while I was there, another flying animal, and I learned all the dragonfly species there. They're particularly useful for assessing the health of aquatic environments throughout the country. So then I came back to the Northeast after that experience. We were in Switzerland for 3 years, and then we moved back to the States. And my first stop, I spent a year in Connecticut working at Yale University, where I was working on this really large project that tries to pull together all of the known observations and range maps for all the species on the planet. So not just birds, but insects and mammals and reptiles and everything that you can imagine, trying to pool all of the information that we have for all of those species in terms of where they're located. So I was working with a huge database on the order of terabytes. Yeah, I really enjoyed that project. I became really familiar with big data, but I really missed working with people. And so that's what led me back to New York, where I am now the project coordinator for the Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is a really great opportunity for me to pull together all of these different experiences in conservation, different approaches, and different skills that I've learned, and come back to something that's a very applied, conservation-oriented project. So I'm going to pause here. That was kind of a lot of information, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of what what types of projects there are out there for someone with a career in bird conservation. And if you have any questions about how that works, or hang on, I'm going to stop sharing for a second there. Yeah, so if you have any questions about conservation or a career in conservation or anything specific about any of my travels, then we can answer those questions now.
Give everyone a moment to be bold. Does anyone have a question for Julie?
Everyone wants to know about ballots.
Yeah, that's quite the map of experiences. I feel like I just went through all those years with you. That was great.
Somebody asked, what's my favorite place to bird in the US? Whew. So I haven't actually been everywhere in the States yet. That's a good question. I do really like the Southeast. So like Arizona, New Mexico is really nice. But I mean, I've seen, you know, the sandhill cranes migrating on the Platte River in Nebraska, which is just amazing. And, you know, sage grouse on their leks, and just there's a huge tree swallow roost on the Connecticut River in Connecticut. So there's just like amazing places anywhere that you live, really. So I'd say that my favorite place is wherever I happen to be. Do I know people who have moved into conservation careers later in life? And do you have advice? So yes, I do know people that have moved into it later in life. I think, you know, people, you might get, you know, might want to switch from one career to another and want to work on something that they're really passionate about. And advice for how to do that, I do think if you can get at least a bachelor's, or if you already have a related career, you can go back and get a master's. That will really give you a leg up. It's fairly competitive right now to find jobs, but then beyond that, I would say, you know, volunteering and interning are really a great way to go, because then people get to know you and you can network. And once they trust you and you gain all these skills, then more opportunities will come to you. If you're particularly interested in birds, there is a bird job listserv called ORN Jobs that is also super helpful if you're looking for places to volunteer to. Identifying birds by song, I think so. Yeah, so by sound, there are a couple apps, which I do have in one of my later slides. So the way I learned was way back with the Peterson CDs, and I found that really helpful then. Nowadays you can do, there's an app called Larkwire that gamifies it basically, and it will play songs of species that are very similar sounding to each other, and then it asks, you know, you keep going through it until you get them all correct, and it gives you tips on how to identify those. That's like a really, I've heard a lot of people have really enjoyed that app. That's been really useful for them. There's also an app called Song Sleuth, which you can play or make a recording, and the app will try to identify the sound for you. It's not a fail-safe by any means. It's much better if you can identify them yourself, but that is also another way to go too. And the best way is really just to go out birding with someone who knows their sounds and just keep asking them.
A question from Bill. He said, did you happen to work with environmental protection in the Caribbean or EPIC on Haiti?
Yeah.
He worked with them himself.
We worked more with USAID, and then Some of the funding was from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They do have some projects working on other species outside the country. And then I mostly worked with a bunch of different nonprofits, like Grupo Joragua, which is in the southwestern part of the Dominican Republic. So I'm not familiar with that one.
And one more question. You talked about bioindicators. Is there a particular species or group of species in New York that you like to use as bioindicators of a healthy, high-functioning habitat?
Yeah, so bioindicators in general, they used to be a thing in the US. They were really popular in, I don't know how to say, late 90s, early 2000s. And people have kind of moved away from them a little bit here in this country. But I would still say, like, particularly for grassland habitats, and I'll talk a little bit about the grassland habitats a little bit later, but there are definitely some species that you would find only in really healthy grassland habitats that you wouldn't find in like a disturbed system. You know, so things like Henslow sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, those are species that you're only going to find in really, really good grassland habitat. And somebody else said they really liked larkwire too, for helping them learn songs. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the atlas. Let me share my screen again. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned before, the New York Breeding Bird Atlas, this is the project that I'm currently working on. So I'm the statewide project coordinator for this, and it is a citizen science project. Anyone can participate, and it just started in January of this year, and it's going to go on for 5 years. So it'll go through the end of 2024, and we do, we've tried to make the protocol or the participation really easy so that many people can participate of all different backgrounds and experience levels. So whatever you can contribute is really helpful. There you go. So first, I just want to briefly go over what is an atlas. So some of you I know are already familiar with atlases, but basically an atlas in general is just like, you know, you can think of your gazetteer or like a National Geographic atlas, and it's just this book, like a collection of different maps and charts and tables, and basically telling you all about one particular subject. So you can think of it as, you know, a collection of books, and you can inventory all of the books that are in your collection. But what we're talking about here is birds. And one of the problems we have with birds is that we have different species all across the state. We have a huge variety and diversity of birds in New York State. So, you know, we have common loons that are up in the North Country. Then you have piping plovers down on Long Island. You have bobolinks in the grasslands, pileated woodpeckers in the forest, blue jays everywhere, basically, black terns up in the marshes, scarlet tanagers in the forest, and you know, herons along Lake Champlain. So how do you go about making any sense of all of the different species and observations in the state? So that's the way that we do that. We make this a much more manageable project by breaking the state up into smaller blocks. So we put this small grid system over the state, and then what people do is they go out to a particular block and they observe all of the species that they can find in that block. So breaking it down into all these smaller blocks allows us to get coverage across the entire state at a really fine resolution. And we can really see, get a snapshot of what is going on in the state within this 5-year period. So when people go to a block, they'll have a list of all these different species that they find breeding there. And then for each species, we can see a list of a map of all the blocks where that species was found. So this is a map for osprey. This is everywhere that the osprey was found in the early 2000s. And then that gives us a really good idea of where they're distributed in the state. So you can see they're on Long Island, they're out throughout the Adirondacks, they're in St. Lawrence Valley, they're all around the Finger Lakes as well. So they're pretty much statewide. So we can do that for all the species, and there's about 250 species breeding in the state of New York. So this is actually the 3rd time we've done this project in the state. The first time was in the 1980s. The second time was in the 2000s. And now we're jumping to the 3rd time, so starting in 2020. So basically every 20 years, the state of New York embarks on this project. And I can tell you a little bit, the second atlas, we had, like I said, about 250 species, a few hybrids. We could compare the data from the first atlas to the second atlas, and we could see that the ranges expanded for about 1/4 of the species, and the ranges contracted for another 1/4 of the species. And then we found 6 new species that we didn't know were breeding in the state. And they moved into the state in that 20-year period for whatever reason. So some of those examples are like trumpeter swan, common eider, black vulture, merlin, sandhill crane, and Wilson's phalarope. So black vulture and merlin have really expanded a lot in the last 20 years. And I expect to see those throughout much of the state by the time that this atlas is over with. Sandhill crane and trumpeter swan are also expanding quite a bit. They're not going to be everywhere, but there is going to be an increase in those populations as well in the state. So the reason why we're doing this atlas is that it's really useful for managing populations. It does allow us to conduct a number of different scientific research projects. After the second atlas came out, there was a bunch of scientific journal articles that looked at the differences between the first and second atlas. One of those was assessing the impact of climate change and showing that species have actually moved north within New York just in that 20-year period. The data are really helpful for, regulatory purposes. So, if we find there's a rare species somewhere, the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, can use that information and say, oh, no, you shouldn't put a wind farm there because we have upland sandpipers nesting there. So it's really important for that purpose. It's also a great way to build the community and people's, enjoyment of nature. And it allows us to monitor changes in the populations. So I'm sure that most of you have heard by now that about this paper that came out last fall, showing that 3 billion birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. And that's pretty much across the board, and all different habitat types. The only one that has been increasing are wetlands, because those are heavily managed systems. But all of the other habitat types, you can look here, grassland habitats grassland birds have really dropped off in the last 50 years, indicating that we're really not doing a good job at managing those habitats. There we go. This is an example of some of the maps that we can produce. So looking at the different changes in distribution on a species level. So this is red-headed woodpecker, which is a species that is declining all across the Northeast. And you can see here, the green is where it was found in both the first two atlases. So that's where it like stayed constant. And the purple is where it showed up newly. So it expanded its range basically. And then the orange, which is the majority of the map, shows where we lost that species in the state. So based on information like this, we can reassess the status, the conservation status of species in the state. So we can say that, you know, for this species in particular, you know, historically we had a secure population of red-headed woodpecker, and now they're imperiled. And, you know, chances are we're going to see that range contract even more during this project, during this atlas, the third atlas. So after you visit a block, the really fun part of atlasing is actually not just getting the species that are breeding there, but also the looking at the breeding behaviors. So looking to see if you can confirm that they're actually nesting in that block. So this is a picture of a black tern on a nest. And so if you were to go out to a wetland and see a black tern on the nest, then you would record that information and submit it to the atlas. Excuse me. And we have a bunch of different behaviors that we recognize for the atlas, and they vary, you know, in intensity from like something that's possibly breeding all the way up to confirmed breeding. So this is really the fun part for me of atlasing, because it gives you this really intimate look into the lives of birds, and you can really see, you know, you can like track them over the summer. You can keep going back to a known nest site, and you can watch it and see the parents progress, and, you know, watch them feeding their young and watch the young get older. And it kind of feels like they're your birds, right? Like they're like your pets almost, and you can go out and observe them and check in on them, and have, you know, you have concern for their survival. So this is the really fun part for me. And so these are some of the behaviors that you would see that we document. So you have a bobolink, which is carrying food. They, you know, they'll have their bill, they'll stuff it full of grubs and worms and things. And then they'll bring it to the nest either for their mate or for the young. Other times you might just see a species, a bird singing, and that does indicate that they're on territory. So that's an important observation. So it is important to learn your songs if you can. Other times it's really obvious that they've succeeded and nested. So, you know, mute swan and a lot of other, you know, geese and ducks, a lot of the waterfowl are really easy to document because you see them with their young really easily. Other species are a little bit harder to find and document. So this is a yellow warbler on its nest, but it's really exciting and rewarding if you do find something on its nest or building its nest. And last weekend I came across like 2 redstarts, American redstarts, which is a small warbler, just busily building their nest out of the old dandelion fluff. And they were just like weaving that into their nest. So that was really fun. Okay, so there's one more step for participating in the atlas. So you visit the block, you observe the birds and the breeding behaviors, and then the third step is to enter the data in eBird. So a lot of people that are already out birding already use eBird. So it's part of the reason we're using it. And the other reason is that it is pretty user-friendly, and it allows us to see the data in real time. So there are multiple ways to enter the data. You can, if you have a smartphone, you can use the eBird app. And if you're more used to recording your data on paper, you can also do that and then submit it online later. And there are a lot of free tutorials that you can watch. I have some on the Alice website that I put together, plus eBird has already put together other tutorials as well. So it's pretty easy to get started. It takes a little bit of time, but once you get used to it, it's pretty easy and straightforward. And then I mentioned before that we've really tried to make this a project where everyone can participate. So, you know, particularly this year with the coronavirus and everyone staying close to home, you know, people aren't going out very far from home to bird. So even just observing the species that are nesting in your backyard, whether you're in, even if you're in a city and all you're seeing are starlings and pigeons, that's also useful information. If you do happen to, you know, see, get into a wilderness area, that's also important. So basically anywhere on that spectrum, as little or as much as you want to be involved, is really helpful. Here is my slide talking a little bit about the different birding tools that can help you get started if you're new to birding. You know, there's all kinds of different books that you can purchase. And then in terms of apps, if you're used to using apps, you can, I highly recommend the Merlin app, which is integrated into eBird, so you can easily switch between the two apps. And Merlin is one of those, is really cool because it will ask you a series of questions and it will say like what color was the bird, how big was the bird, where was it, and what type of behavior was it showing. And then it will show you a list of possible species that you can choose from. Or you can take a picture, you can show it a picture and it will ID it. And it's actually really good at photo identification. Or you can just use it to listen to sounds while you're in the field and just make sure, oh, is that what I'm hearing? I think that's an oriole, but I'm not sure. You can just play the sound and double check yourself. So that's a really great app. I use Audubon, the free Audubon app similarly, also for sounds and looking at range and habitat distribution. Song Sleuth I mentioned before, it's where you can play a sound and it will identify the song for you, which is pretty cool. There's also the website All About Birds, which is also through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, but that has information on life history as well, so nesting information, breeding information. And then there are a couple of paid options as well. So Larkwire, it is a small fee. I can't remember if it's around $10, I think. And then there's almost all of your field guides come nowadays in app form as well. So you can have the field guide with you on your phone wherever you are, and you don't have to carry all the extra weight. And then Birds of the World is kind of like All About Birds, but on steroids. So that's like the definitive source. If you want to know anything about birds, that's like a whole, you know, for each species, they have an expert go through and write a whole species account for each species, using all the literature that's out there. And that's global, but it's really good for North American birds. So that's also a great option. I think if you have an eBird account, or any account with the Cornell Lab, I think it's like $35 a year to have access to that. So far this year, we just started in January and we haven't even hit the core part of the breeding season yet. We already have over 1,100 people who have participated in the project. Over 50,000 bird checklists have been submitted, and more than half of the species that breed in the state have already been confirmed nesting in the state. So I listed the 10 most most commonly reported species so far. And in parentheses, what I've listed is the number of those atlas blocks, all those small blocks that make up the state, the number of blocks where they've been confirmed breeding. So you can see Canada goose are all over the state, lots of fledglings out right now. Robins, starlings, house sparrows, of course, but also osprey, chickadees, eagles, and bluebirds. So if you're looking to do a little bit of birding this weekend and want to try your hand at atlasing, then these might be the species that you'd want to focus on and try to find, since they are actively nesting right now. So this is a map from the eBird website for the atlas. And this shows you how many species people have already observed breeding in just the Indian River Black Lakes region. And, you know, there's a fair number of species have already been documented, and but there's also still quite a bit of room for improvement, I would say. And so I put down here the Indian River Lakes. There's a couple of blocks that cover the core part of the area. And some of these blocks have very little data so far submitted. If you scroll up to like Lisbon Grasslands or Fort Drum or Perch River, you'll see obviously there's a lot of birders that go to those places. And that's important for the atlas, but we also want to make sure that we cover the whole state. So if you're looking for a new project, there's definitely a lot of opportunity to help us out in the Upper St. Lawrence Valley. So with that, I'm gonna kind of switch from talking about the breeding bird atlas, and then I'll take a break for questions, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the particular species that we're really interested in, that are really important in the Upper St. Lawrence Valley. So.
Does anyone have any questions on what Julie presented about the atlas? You can raise your hand or you can type it and I'll read it.
It looks like.
Hey,
so,
Julie,
oh yeah.
I've got a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Wilson got to name a lot of birds. Who was that person? And it just seems like an inordinate amount of birds were named after him, or he got to name them, I guess. So, can you explain, please? Thank you.
I don't know a ton about him, but yeah, I mean, he was a really active ornithologist, and I think in the same time as John James Audubon. Particularly, for some reason in my head, I feel like he was mostly in the southwestern part of the country, but I'm not positive on that. But yeah, he's one of there's a few different ornithologists that have a lot of names, a lot of bird names named after them. I'd say, I'm trying to think, like Nuttall has some, and I'm gonna say Sutton, but Sutton has, I think, mostly in the Latin name, has a lot of Latin names after him instead of the common names. But yeah, one of those people that was out identifying all the diversity in the country early on.
It's the right place, the right time, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, this is Elliot. I don't think you can see a picture. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So several years ago, IRLC and Tilt and one other collaborator worked on some rehabilitation of habitat. Is that the kind of thing that would come out of this study? And the better these study, the better when we can identify those places that habitat remediation would be a useful thing to do?
Yes, I'm hesitant to say yes completely because so for the second breeding bird atlas, the data were collected at that block level, which is about 9 square miles. And this time we're collecting data at a finer scale than that, even because we're collecting it at the checklist level. So it'll be either a point or just like your traveling route. So it'll only be like a mile or 2 mile trail or something. So with that, we'll have a much finer scale to really look at the species and the habitats that they're associated with. But having said that, there still will be some room to be able to identify and say, you know, this area is now supporting a lot more early successional species, like shrub species. So we would be able to say, oh, probably a lot of farms were abandoned and now it's growing up into shrubs, or vice versa. You know, if you were in an area and did a lot of restoration, and if it was a large enough area, it would also show up in the atlas data as well.
Yeah, this was golden wing warbler work that we did with them.
Yeah, hopefully that will show up. I'm going to show some maps for golden wings in a little bit. Yeah, Vicky. Don't hear you.
There. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Julie, would it be advisable when we submit to eBird to submit a habitat photograph if we find a nesting bird or nesting behavior?
It's not necessary.
But would it be useful?
I would say only if it's a species that using the habitat information would allow you to confirm the species identification.
Okay.
But in terms of, you know, conservation and knowing what's on the ground, probably not as much, because we don't really have a good way to really scan those photos.
Okay.
Yeah. It looks like, so Anna had a question about, she's from Guatemala and wanted to know how the Bird Atlas project started, because they have very little information there in Guatemala. So Bird Atlases are actually a global thing that started in the 60s in the UK. And so the first one came out in a small region in the United Kingdom. And then since then, it has really taken off across the globe. So there's a lot of atlases that have taken place in Africa, and all throughout Europe, North America. All the states and provinces have had breeding bird atlases. I think less so in Latin America, but it generally is something that a large organization would organize. So whether it be the BirdLife International Partner or a statewide ornithological association or countrywide association, that would be probably the place to start. And sometimes, you know, like California is a huge state and they don't do a single atlas. They actually break it up into smaller counties. So maybe in Guatemala, there's not enough funding or something, or enough people to do a whole countrywide atlas at the start, but you could do just a smaller area first, and then hopefully gain momentum and expand from there.
Julie, we also had a couple of questions. When using eBird, how do we specifically contribute to the atlas, or do all the entries in New York get associated with the atlas?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm glossing over a lot of details just because I want to cover a lot of information in the talk. But so within eBird, there are different what they call portals. And so basically they have, they're just like subsets of eBird that are designed to specifically support either a state or a country or a project. So we have an Atlas portal. So there's two ways to make sure that your data go into the Atlas. If you're using the app, the eBird app on your phone, you have to set the portal in the app settings to the New York Breeding Bird Atlas. If you're entering data online, then you have to go to our website, which is ebird.org/atlasny. And let me I'll put a link into the chat where I explain all of this. So I just put a link there. Oh, somebody else already put a link to the project homepage. So I put a direct link to how to submit data specifically for the Atlas. Okay, and then somebody else entered information about Wilson. Alexander Wilson. Wiley. Somebody said he was an early ornithologist, was a painter and contemporary of Audubon, lived in Philly part of his life, and then settled in Ovid, New York.
Does anyone else have any other questions for Julie? I think I got all of them in the chat.
Yeah. Can you change the portal? Yes, that's really easy to change the portal. I think that's on that same page I just sent you. Yeah. That same link I just sent shows you how to change the portal. So, okay. All right, so let me go through the last part of my talk is actually about some of the really cool special birds in the, oops, let me get over here, in the Indian River Lakes area. So probably a lot of you guys already know this if you're a birder. But you might not have seen some of the actual Atlas data that's come out of the past Atlases, and you might not realize just how special some of the birds are in your area. So the Indian River is an important bird area. So within the state of New York, it has importance for supporting birds in the state. And so on this map, I show some of the other important bird areas in the region. And the main habitat types, so, excluding the Adirondacks there, the main habitat types that you'll find in the region are wetlands, grasslands, and shrublands. And so I'm going to walk through some of the special birds in each of those different habitat types. And we'll start with wetland birds. So hopefully a lot of you are already familiar with osprey. That's what I have up in the top right. They have very conspicuous nests. They're really easy to observe and watch, and it's really fun to watch the adults bring fish in to feed their young. And then in the bottom right, I have a picture of an American bittern, which a lot of people are familiar with the sound, even though you may not have seen one. They're extremely hard to see, but they do that oonka-loonk sound. I was going to do a recording for you, but the recordings tend not to work very well on Zoom. So I just try to imitate a little bit, but I'm not very good. And then on the left-hand side is least bittern. This is the, smaller cousin to the American bittern. I find this one is even harder to find, but they're kind of similar. They're smaller. They are also in that same dense marshy habitat. And then just to show you how funny sometimes the young birds can look, I have a picture in the bottom left of a young least bittern. So it still has that same coloration and that large bill, but it's just like spiky, downy feathers all over. So kind of these cute little fluff balls. Some other wetland birds. Go on. There we go. Black tern. I've had a few pictures of black terns in the presentation so far. And they're pretty distinctive. They're a really small tern. They have these black bellies, and they tend to breed only in marshes. And you can see this map here is actually where they were found in the second breeding bird atlas, so in the 2000s, 2000 and 2005. And you can see that most of those records are from St. Lawrence and Jefferson counties. So this is a species that is highly monitored by the state, but it's always, it's very important for a high conservation priority. But it's one that they do fly a lot. So once their young have fledged, you might see them really busily taking care of their young. Another one that is also important in your area are pied-billed grebes. So you can see this map. There are some scattered across the entire state, but if you look up in this northern region here, up in that St. Lawrence Valley, again, like that is the core part of their breeding range within the state of New York. So these birds, they're really small. They're basically like, people describe them as a little football. Their body is like a little football, and then they have this little head. And they're named because the adults have a pale bill with a black line on them. But the young are super stripy on their head, and then they have these red bills and red on their head as well. So they're very distinctive. And if you see some of those, definitely enter those in the atlas. This is a species that is, that's kind of on the edge, should it be listed in the state or not? So we really want to collect data on this species. Grassland birds. There's a lot of grassland birds that I could show you. A lot of them are declining, as I mentioned earlier. There's just not a lot of grassland habitat, intact grassland habitat left. But bobolinks are really fun. They're really loud and vocal, and they make that kind of like bloop, 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 R2D2 type sound when they're flying over the grasslands. So they're very conspicuous. And then on the, whoops, I'm sorry. Grasshopper sparrows, you can see in the picture that I have here why they're called a grasshopper sparrow. No, actually they're named grasshopper sparrow because their song sounds very much like a grasshopper sound. But they do eat grasshoppers and worms as well. In the bottom, one of the iconic species is the northern harrier. This is a female northern harrier looking for food over the fields, and this is one of the few raptors in the state that will hover. So if you see a large bird that's staying in place over the grassland, look to see if it has a white patch on its back, on the rump, and that's a harrier. And they, all these species are nesting on the ground or just above the ground, and they're all super susceptible to any type of farming or mowing or trampling. So, that's a really, as we were talking about before, a good indicator of a healthy grassland system. Sedge wren, I leave till last because it's kind of a grassland / wetland type species. So they really live in sedges. There's really not that many of them left in the state. And anytime someone finds one, a birder finds one, everyone has to go and find it because they're so hard to find, and they're exciting. But they're in these wet sedge areas in the middle of a grassland or a field. So that's another really cool species. And then again, there. Henslow sparrow. So this is the map for Henslow sparrow. They make, it's described as like if you have a pan of oil and then you put like water on there and it sizzles, that's the sound that they make. And you'll see here, so there's a few scattered places across the state, but the majority of them are right there around the Indian River Lakes area, so all in St. Lawrence County. Wait, is that Jefferson County? Sorry. And then of course the other one as well is upland sandpiper. Both of these species are used quite a bit. I get a lot of requests from DC to know locations for these species because they use these to assess the health of the habitat and then also to prevent development in those areas because there's so few areas left in the state that support these species. And upland sandpipers, definitely look this up online and listen to their song because their song is pretty wild, coming from a shorebird that lives in a grassland. They do tend to stand up nice in the open on fence posts and they'll start singing. Yeah, they're kind of a fun species that are, like you can see from this map, they're really concentrated in that one area. Shrubland birds, so this can be shrub or scrubby areas. And these species are also quite hurting in the state. There's now, when I first started doing conservation in New York in the early 2000s with Audubon, there was hardly any shrub habitat left in the state. It was mostly along power line right of ways and along the edges of roads and things like that. But since then, the state has really stepped up and tried to support more of this type of habitat. So some of these species are doing a little bit better. These are some of the cool species that you would find in shrub areas. So the eastern towhee, which is beautiful and does this funny little hopping and tossing leaves and stuff. So they're kind of fun to watch. Field sparrows do a little ping pong sound. Their song is like a little ping pong ball falling on a table. Brown thrashers are just really beautiful, large birds, and they mimic other bird songs. And then this is a young American woodcock. Probably most of you are familiar with the adult courtship display. They do this amazing flight display in the air and do all this calling and noise with their feathers and stuff like that. So they're pretty fun too. Whippoorwills are declining. All of the nightjars, so whippoorwill, chuckwill's widow, and common nighthawk are all declining all across the eastern part of the country. And whippoorwills, are one of those iconic sounds that a lot of people remember from their childhood, but now are really hard to come by. So that's another one. If you tend to be more of a night owl and you hear whippoorwills, definitely report that to the Atlas. And just for kicks, I put in a little picture of some babies. They look really funny. And then last but not least are the golden-winged warblers. So probably a lot of you are familiar with these guys. Golden-winged warblers are a beautiful species. They have this bright golden yellow and then this very striking black patch on their throat. But they're declining. There's a whole conservation group organized around this species to try to bring them back. And part of the problem with them is that they are hybridizing with the blue-winged warbler. So that's the picture on the bottom. And when they hybridize, they mate with each other, you get the Brewster's warbler, which is up in the top right. And then if you get a Brewster's warbler that mates with either a golden-winged or blue-winged, then you get a Lawrence's warbler. So basically what you're getting is there's much fewer golden wings, pure golden wings out there than there used to be, and basically they're all they're outcompeted by blue wings. Their gene pool is being decreased by blue wings. Their habitat is declining because of habitat management practices and also because of climate change. So this is a species that is really of concern. So you can see here, blue-winged warblers are throughout much of the state. They are moving northward. And then if you compare that with golden-winged warblers, you can see that the core part of their breeding range in the state is really that area in the upper St. Lawrence Valley. So one of the fun things about these species is that they all will sing all of the songs. So if you hear a blue-winged song, it might be a golden-winged, or it could be a Brewster's or a Lawrence's, and vice versa. So for these birds, you really want to see the bird and really pay attention to where the yellow and the black is on the bird, and then you can identify it from there. But we really want to keep track of where those pure golden-winged warblers are. But if you see any of the other, blue-winged or the hybrids, that's also really important for us to know and track, so we can keep tabs on this species in the state. All right, this is the last slide. I know you guys are getting tired. I'm getting tired. So if you are interested in getting involved in the Breeding Bird Atlas, I do recommend visiting the website, which has been posted in the chat. You can sign up for our mailing list or newsletter, which I send out monthly. And the link for that is on the website. We have a volunteer handbook on the website. I also just revamped the website and tried to make it a lot more user-friendly. We are on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. So whatever your habit is, then we're on there. And then the most important thing is to go out atlasing and then submit your data on eBird and have fun while you're doing it. And with that, I can take any last questions that people might have.
So there was a question in the chat box about whether or not you'll be partnering with localized surveying efforts. For example, the Montezuma muck race participants.
Yeah, so I am reaching out to larger volunteer programs and efforts for sure. Montezuma muck race, I think most people are entering their data in eBird already. And anyone that uses eBird in the state of New York has received an email from me about the Atlas. So they've already been recruited. And there'll probably be more emails like that to you. And then, yeah, I'm also coordinating with, state parks and DC and other nonprofit organizations that have monitoring programs, bird landing stations, all of that too, to try to get data from everyone. which nightjar is most threatened. Actually, the data indicate that the nighthawks are declining more than the other two, but all of them have seen over 50% declines in the state in the last 20 years. So, and they're, I mean, that's across the entire eastern seaboard. Their populations are just declining like crazy, and it's not really exactly clear why, but most likely because there's fewer insects and fewer of those large hawk moths and things to eat.
Anybody else have questions for Julie? Well, thank you, Julie. That was a wonderful presentation. So much fun.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for everyone for attending.
Yeah.
If we have birders out there who are birding in the Indian River Lakes region, please send us your photos. We want to see what you're seeing out there. So stay in touch with us. Do you have any last words you want to say, Julie, to the audience?
All the data that people are collecting, anybody can view at any time. So if you're curious what other people are seeing in the area, you can go onto the website and check it out.
Great. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care. Be safe. Have a great Memorial Day.
Great
Happy
presentation.
birthday.
Thank you.
Yes, and a happy birthday, Julie.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye now.
Good night.
Can you hear me?